Would you like to shoot images like this? If not, bye-bye. If so, stay tuned and I will show you how. This is a technique called shutter drag, where we combine flash with a slow shutter speed to record both a still image and motion in the one photograph. And it's possible to do it in camera without any editing. It's much easier than you think it is. You've seen quite a few of my shutter drag images. I have thousands of them. This is one of my favourite long exposure techniques. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to do shutter drag photography. I'm going to show you lots of my shutter drag images, and I'm going to show you a live studio shoot where we do shutter drag, so you'll understand the basic principles of what we do. Now, we can get many different effects with shutter drag. The main thing is that we use a flash to get our still image of our subject, and then we can use movement with that slower shutter speed. So say for instance we set a shutter speed of 3 seconds. Our flash will fire as soon as we push the shutter button, which will give us our still image. Then we have 3 seconds to do something to make that image look a little bit different. We can add something to that image like fire or sparks. We can move the camera around to show some movement in the background. We can also have our subject move to show movement after that still image has occurred. There are lots of different techniques that we can use. Generally speaking, we shoot shutter drag images in darker conditions because that gives us the option to use those slow shutter speeds without overexposing our image. It is possible to do it on lighter backgrounds just by reducing our aperture or using some neutral density filters. But most of the time we shoot it at night, in the evening, or in darker conditions in the studio. There are many ways to use shutter drag in camera. We can have our subject move after the flash. We can move our camera after the flash. We can move our light after the flash goes off. Or we can have our background move after the flash fires. This technique overlaps some other photography techniques, such as intentional camera movement or long exposure photography. The difference is that we use flash in shutter drag so that we have that still image and then we have the blurred background or foreground or subject in our image as well. Now, it doesn't have to be a blurred background or subject. It can be something that we've placed in the image after the flash has gone off. And you'll see a lot of the different things that we do with that technique. We can use fire, we can use flames, we can use LEDs, we can use a range of different things to enhance our image after that initial flash is fired. So, in shutter drag photography, we have 2 exposures to consider. The first one is our flash exposure. So we need to make sure that our flash is bright enough to expose our subject properly. Our second part of our exposure is our long shutter speed. So we need to be sure that long shutter speed is not going to overexpose our ambient light. So we need to consider those 2 things to start with. Generally speaking, I will set my slow shutter speed to start with and then vary my aperture to get my background looking the way that I want it to, and then I set my flash off and adjust my flash power to get the light on my subject. It's very similar to using any sort of flash technique. The only difference is that we're trying to get that longer shutter speed, that slower shutter speed, so that we can do something after our flash is fired. Now, I shoot mainly people, so people tend to be my main subject in my image. So my shutter drag techniques revolve around photographs of people. When we're considering our flash exposure and our slow shutter speed, there are 2 variables that we can play with, and that's got to do with our flash synchronisation. We can set our flash to fire at the beginning of our long exposure, or we can set our flash to go off at the end of our long exposure. At the beginning, when our flash fires, that's called front curtain sync, because the flash fires as soon as the shutter opens. That first shutter curtain opens and the flash fires immediately. Then our lag in our shutter speed is after the flash exposure. In rear curtain sync, our exposure occurs first and then our flash fires right at the end, just before our shutter closes. That's called rear curtain sync. A lot of photographers think that because we're doing long exposures, we need to use rear curtain sync. I'm not a fan of rear curtain sync. It works in some situations, but not as many as a lot of people think. The problem I have with rear curtain sync, because I'm shooting people, is that I can't tell exactly what pose or what position my subject's going to be in when that rear curtain flash fires. I can just guess a little bit so that maybe I can count 1, 2, 3 seconds and hope that my subject's in the correct pose. But it doesn't always work. So I much prefer front curtain sync so that I can put my model or my subject in the pose that I want, and then the flash fires, they look great, and then that continuing exposure exposes my blur or my whatever I want to do with that exposure at the end. Now you may think, and you may have seen, that a lot of photographers use rear curtain sync because they want the blur to be behind their subject, which looks more natural to us when we view the subject. But what we can do is simply move our subject backwards if we want that same situation. And you'll see in the studio shoot that I do with Layla at the end of this class that we can produce very similar results with front curtain or rear curtain sync. It's just a matter of being able to control your subject much more easily with front curtain sync. Here are some ways that I use shutter drag in my photography. The first one is with fire or sparks. Obviously, whenever we're using fire or any sort of hot material, we need to be very careful, very conscious of safety. So make sure that your subject is totally safe. Maybe do it as 2 exposures if you need to retain that safety. A lot of my fire shots are done with 2 exposures, but a lot of them are done in a single exposure as well. I just make sure that my subjects are safe so that they're not going to get burned, or that they're very versed with this style of photography and they're fire performers. Fire performers are very careful with their safety, and I can rely on them to do the right thing so we don't have any accidents. Now we can vary our shutter speed with these shutter drag images. We can have a long exposure which gives us maybe 10 or 15 or even 20 seconds to do what we need to do after that initial flash fires. Or we can set our shutter speed a little bit faster to maybe a 20th or a 40th of a second, so that we just get a little bit of movement in that subject. It's up to you. It's up to your creative process to set that shutter speed at a value that's going to get you the image that you require. I often use a fan on my model's hair with that long exposure so that I can get that hair moving around, and use an LED light or something to light that hair, either with a gel or without a gel, just so that I get the movement in that hair. Dancers are great to shoot with long exposures or shutter drag techniques because we can get that sharp image of the dancer in the pose and then the movement as they move around the image. Again, a long exposure will give you more blur in that subject, a shorter exposure will give you less. Light drawing. I can shoot off my flash to get my sharp subject, and then I can use my LEDs or whatever light tools I've got to move through that image while that shutter stays open so that I can create some light drawing images. There are a lot of different LEDs you can use for this technique. It just depends on what you want to do, what sort of tools you have. Practice a little bit makes a big difference with this sort of technique. You can rotate the camera after that shutter fires. It makes me a little bit seasick to look at some of these images like this, but it's possible. You can attach your camera to your vehicle, as I do with a lot of my photography. Again, you need to be very careful of safety, and you don't want to lose your camera also, but you can attach your camera to your vehicle and drive along. I use this technique in car parks where it's very safe, at night where there's not much traffic around, and I just travel at slow speeds, because the length of your shutter speed will give the impression of faster speeds, but you can just travel at 10 kilometers an hour or 15 kilometers an hour and get the results that you're looking for. The jiggle. I often do jiggly images, so I'll shoot my subject with flash and then I jiggle my camera around just to get those background lights looking a little bit more interesting. We can jiggle up and down, we can jiggle sideways. There's a lot of different ways that we can create a pattern from those point light sources in the background when we're shooting at night. You can also move your camera to the left or the right or up or down. As long as you don't cover over your subject's face with those lights that are going to appear when you use that camera movement, then it looks fantastic. Water movement. You can use a slow shutter speed to blur that water, as we've seen in a lot of landscape images, but have your subject nice and sharp, being lit by the flash, and the shutter drag is the thing that creates that silky water in the movement. You can use two flashes. You can have one fire at the beginning of your exposure and another one fire at the end, so that you can map the movement of one image to another, one dance pose to another, or one expression to another. It's a matter of firing the first flash on front curtain sync, which is your default setting on your camera, and then having a second one fire manually just as the exposure finishes. Abstract images. You can use a little bit of flash, a little bit of light painting, a little bit of movement to create an amazing abstract type of image. Whether you're shooting people or cityscapes or whatever you like, you can do amazing things that way. And some more obscure options such as defocusing. You can shoot your subject as a sharp image when that flash fires and then defocus during that trailing, dragging exposure so that you get a slightly blurred image outside a sharp image. That's something I want to experiment with a bit more in the future. So a couple of tips when you're doing this shutter drag photography. Any sort of movement in your subject or your camera is going to show up more if you have some highlights on your subject. If you have your subject dressed in a spotty or a stripy outfit, those spots or stripes are going to create movement in that image as they move. Lighter clothes, white dresses, white shirts are going to give you more of that movement appearance in that image, if that's what you want. But you do need to be careful not to overexpose those white areas. Try not to drag lights over your subject's face. When you're shooting at night and you're doing the jiggle or the drag, just be careful that you don't have those lights going across your subject's face, because that can get in the way of a really good image. Another tip is when you are moving, when you're doing your shutter drag, you've taken your shot and you want your lines to move downwards in your image, you need to move your camera upwards. So your lines in your image from that shutter drag will appear the opposite to how your camera moves. So if you want your lines to appear on the right-hand side of your subject, you need to move your camera to the left. It's a little bit confusing at the beginning, but you'll get it. Also, if you're in the studio and you have access to LED lights to light your subject for that shutter drag, maybe put them behind your subject or off to the back, three-quarter backlight I call it, so that your main subject's face is not going to be lit with those LEDs, so that you get a nice sharp image of their face and the front of them, and those LEDs will give you that movement in the background from the rim lighting that's coming from the back. And the last one is try to add some colour to your image. The more colour you have in your image, the more interesting it's going to be. You could use LEDs with gels, you could use different coloured LEDs, you could use Christmas lights, a whole range of different things. Shoot in an area where there's a lot of neon lights and bright different colours. That will add a lot to the resulting images that you get. And of course you can do this technique with your phone as well. If you don't have an SLR camera or a mirrorless camera, you can just set the manual exposures on your phone, set your flash up so that your flash will fire as soon as your shutter opens, and that slower exposure will allow you to get those movement lines or that fire or those sparks or whatever you want to get in the background while that shutter is dragging, staying open. So here is a studio shoot we did with Layla, just explaining the basic principles of shutter drag against a dark background. There are lots of different techniques we use through here. I've progressed right from a still image all the way through to using coloured gels in the photographs. Okay, we're in the studio today and we're going to be dragging our shutter, which sounds a little bit rude, but what we're going to do is we're going to use a slow shutter speed to create a bit of movement in our image. Layla is our model. We're going to do a range of different techniques today, but basically when we're dragging our shutter, we need to shoot against a dark background because we don't want to overexpose our image. We want to light Layla with a flash, and then we use a constant light to continue that exposure to give some blur into the image. Now, generally it's better to have your model in lighter clothing so she'll stand out against that background, but we've got a range of different outfits that we're going to do today and you'll see the differences between them all. We're going to start off by just using a slow shutter speed with a little bit of movement in the shot, and we're going to build it up from there. We're going to add some flash, then we're going to add some color to it, and you'll see as we go all of the different shots that we can get. So we're going to start out with just taking a shot of Layla, just with a normal shutter speed. We're on 1/30th of a second. I've got my camera on the tripod, so that's a normal shutter speed that we might use in this environment to get a shot of Layla with the available light. So just standing there, Layla, good shot, good. Okay, so that's our standard shot that we started with. Now we're going to lengthen our shutter speed. We're going to go to a shutter speed of 2 seconds, and we're going to ask Layla to move after the shutter goes off. Now we're just using available light here. We're not using any flash at all. Okay, here we go, Layla. Okay. That's it. So you can see the results of that. We've got that movement in there because our long shutter speed and the movement from Layla, but we haven't really got a sharp image of Layla. This is where our flash comes in. Our flash will give us an instantaneous amount of light, and that will give us a solid image of Layla. Then we'll have the movement in there as well. And this is what we call dragging the shutter. Now we're adding a little bit of flash to our shot. I've got my flash on my camera, so it's just direct flash, and we'll see how this turns out. Again, we're going to get Layla to move as soon as she sees the flash fire. Okay, Layla, here we go. So that shot looks good, but I'd like that blur to be a little bit more noticeable, a little bit more bright. So rather than just use the studio lights here, I've got an LED light, a large LED light over to the left of camera that's going to brighten up that blurry movement from Layla. So you can see that's a little bit brighter still. So that 2-second exposure that we're using is pretty much ideal for the space that we've got to work with here. We've got that dark background, we've got the solid image of Layla, and then we've got that blurriness behind her. I'm going to lift this up again a little bit by using off-camera flash rather than on-camera flash, because it gives me a bit more texture and shape in my subject. Okay, so this is going to be the flash on you. So I need you to start by facing this way, if we can. Yep, that's it. Maybe over that way a little bit more, so you're in frame. Yep, because I've got a vertical frame, so there's only a certain amount. So this is going to light you, and then we're going to get you to move back over that way. Yeah? Okay. All right, now we're going to shoot with front curtain and rear curtain sync. You may have heard these terms mentioned before. They're technical terms. I'm not going to go into it too much here, but with front curtain sync, which is your normal synchronization mode on your camera, the default setting, your flash fires as soon as your shutter opens, and then the shutter stays open after that, which is what we've been using at the moment. As soon as that flash fires, then Layla can move to give us some movement behind her. A lot of people feel that using rear curtain sync is a better option because your shutter opens and then you get the movement, and then at the end you get the fire of the flash. Now I'm not totally convinced of that for the reasons that I've mentioned to you previously in this class, but I'll show you the differences between rear curtain and front curtain sync. First we're shooting with the front curtain. Okay, with this shot, Layla, what we're going to do is just get you to walk across slowly. You need to turn towards the light so that we get that light on your face. Yep. So after the flash fires, I want you to turn around and just walk back this way. Okay? Yep. All right. That's it. That's good. All right. Here we go. So that was shot with front curtain sync. Layla saw the flash fire and then she walked across away from the flash. When we use rear curtain sync, the blur starts first and then the flash fires off. So we're going to do that now and you'll see the difference. All right, I'll count 3 and you start walking. 1, 2, 3. Okay, you can see the difference between the two. One system, the flash fires first and then the shutter stays open after that. The other one, the shutter opens up and then the flash fires at the end. Now, as you've heard before, I prefer front curtain sync because with rear curtain sync, I can never tell what position Layla's in when that flash fires. I can count 1, 2 seconds and hope that that's going to happen, but I much prefer using front curtain sync. So if I wanted to get that same result as we just got here with front curtain sync, all I need to do is get Layla to pose in the pose that looks good, and then as soon as the flash fires, I can get her to walk backwards. It gives me the same effect. So rear curtain sync is much less useful than a lot of photographers think it is. Okay, we'll do that now and you'll see. Okay, here we go. So as soon as that flash fires, just walk backwards. Ready? That's it. You see, we get a similar result that way. So now we're going to add a little bit of colour to our shot. I've got the cone, the standard reflector for my LED light. I've just put a little bit of cellophane over the front of it to give us blue light rather than natural white light. So as you can see, we've got a blue constant light on now. We've turned the lights out in the studio. So we've got the flash that's going to give us the sharp image of Layla, and then we're going to have blue continuous lines as she moves across the frame. Okay, so that pose looks great. Just need you to turn your face towards that light. Yep, push that knee in just a little bit more. Yeah, okay. All right, yeah, here we go, Layla. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, terrific. Okay, maybe just do a little bit of a swivel. Whatever you can do in those heels is okay. All right, here we go. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, terrific. All right, now what I want you to do is to turn towards the light, okay? Yep, and when you move, maybe just duck down like this. Yeah, just so that we've got a little bit of dip in the movement. Okay. Yeah, here we go. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. All right. Yeah, that looks good. I love that. Maybe a little bit more of a dynamic pose to start with. So maybe your foot back or something, and maybe a hand up or. Yeah, that sort of thing. So you can see they look great. What I'm going to do now is just lengthen that shutter speed. I'm going to go from 2 seconds to 6 or 8 seconds, just to give Layla a little bit more room to move around the set and get more of those movement lines. wiggle around. Move those arms around a little bit as you go. Yep. Try and keep your face away from that LED. So turn your face towards this light. Yep. And try and keep it that way all the time while your hands are moving around. That's it. We're going to vary it now by moving our light source. Remember early on I said we could move our camera, we could move our model, or we can use move our light source. So we've got a couple of light sources here, some LED light sources. I've got this really cool lightsaber here that has different colours on it. It's got a bit of a Star Wars noise to it as well, but we'll get around that. As I shake this, it changes colour, as you can see. So once the flash goes off, whoop, excuse me, got to push the right button. There we go. So after the flash goes off and we get that sharp image of Layla, I'm going to move in behind her with the lightsaber and create a bit of movement, a bit of lines in behind her. I'm also going to use this, which is light wire. You can buy on the internet, it's quite cheap. When we turn it on, it lights up, and I'm going to wave it in behind Layla too, and a little bit in front of her, just to surround her with this light wire LED effect. So you'll see the results that we get. We need to shoot this in the dark, and we've turned off our constant light because we want complete darkness or near to it if we can. So it'll be a bit of a challenge for our video. We'll see how we go. So we got some great images today. Layla was amazing, as she always is. The dynamic feeling of these shots just lifts them up above all of the other stuff that you see around. You can do so many things by just knowing your camera settings and how to manipulate them to get this sort of result. So simply using a flash with a slower shutter speed, a couple of coloured gels, you can do some fantastic images.